So welcome and thank you to have stayed on this side. We're going to have a talk on the global outlook for responsible tech. So just a few words about myself. I'm the moderator for this. My name is Xin Labbé, and I'm a journalist and a podcast host and producer. My podcast is called Good Code, and it's looking at ethics in digital technologies, so you might want to check it out. And we have three amazing guests today, so I'm really excited. Right next to me is Anush Tatevosyan. Anush, you're a strategic communication advisor and consultant, and most recently you've worked on the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Then next to you is Mark Latonero, who's the research lead for human rights at Data and Society and a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. And then we have Mona Sloan, who's a sociologist and a fellow at NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge. So we'll dive right into it so that we can start that conversation. Anush, I'm going to turn to you first. You, as I was just saying, you worked on this effort by the UN Secretary General to advance global digital cooperation. So can you tell us a little bit about why that came to be and what place was given to this notion of responsibility and fairness in that discussion?
Definitely. Can you hear me okay? Yes, so as Sheen said, a project that I worked on for a year and a little bit more last year that culminated in June 2019 is something that was led by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, called a high-level panel on digital cooperation. A high-level panel is just a long word of saying an expert commission. So the Secretary General put together an expert commission to look at this issue of digital cooperation. And that's not a term that's necessarily in use. It was sort of on purpose created as a new phrase because we didn't want to tie it to internet governance or tie it to cybersecurity specifically or tie it to some of these things that already have definitions or are a little bit loaded or mean, some people shut off when they hear just one because they're like, that's not what I do. Whereas what we were looking for is a terminology that meant digital cooperation, meaning everything that is required to, and the different stakeholders that are required to bring together the governance and the ethical frameworks and the just general, the outcomes that we want out of a digital future that are more in favor of humanity. So I think it's really apt here being at this conference where the name is All Tech is Human because this was the point. Secretary General of the UN is actually an engineer by training. And before he got into politics, he was an engineer. And he comes to his career at the UN deeply with a deep understanding and an interest in tech, but also coming from, his many years in service in the UN, very concerned about the human impact. And he's personally very concerned about the fact that 50% of the population of the planet still doesn't have a basic internet. Meanwhile, those of us who do are starting to race ahead and thinking about 5G and deep fakes and all these things, and that gap is crazy. The gender gaps are crazy. The fact that we have cyber attacks ongoing and there's no way to govern them is crazy. The list goes on of the issues, and so the UN is known for fostering global cooperation, whether it's around cooperation around climate change or managing our seas or battling poverty globally. So cooperation is a theme of the UN in general, and digital cooperation is this next wave that the Secretary General would like to advance, which is that if we want to have a equitable, safe, ethical, inclusive digital future, it's going to take deep cooperation, not only between governments, but also between a lot of the other stakeholders in this space, which are the industry, the research community, the individuals, all of us who use technology. And I mean, when you really think about it in terms of what the lives of our children might be like, and the previous lightning talk was really interesting from that perspective, and the UN often is thinking about the future we want for our children, it gets to be really hairy because we just don't have rules of the road today about the governance of a lot of these new technologies.
So the report interestingly started with an invitation to commit to a declaration of digital interdependence. And I think you might not be on. Because I sound much louder than you do.
Maybe I just wasn't speaking up.
So why was that important to start with this invitation to realize and commit that we're all digitally interdependent?
Yes, so this expert panel resulted there, they did a year of consultations, which was quite express. I mean, 1 year is not enough to tackle this big issue, but it was, it's urgent and it moves fast. So the UN didn't want to spend 5 years on this first step. We just did 1 year, and then the consultations and discussion and fallout will continue. But at the end of the 1 year with this expert panel, which I should note was led by Melinda Gates and Jack Ma, so that just gives you a sense of the diversity and global outlook that this panel comprised, which then, in addition to those two tech leaders, included a lot of government officials, former foreign ministers, activists, academics, a Nobel Prize winner on economics and regulation. So it was a real mix of experts. And their final product was a report in June, which, as Sheen mentioned, starts with, the report is called The Age of Digital Interdependence. And the first section of the report makes an invitation to all of us to commit to sort of digital interdependence. And that is just referring to the fact that anything that takes place in the digital age and future has these knock-on effects, and we are not isolated users. And I think that's something maybe our panel is here to address as part of today's program, the global perspective or the global outlook. I think two really easy to understand examples from the last year or so. For instance, in India, last year, there was a major, what they were even calling a national health crisis, because there was massive misinformation about vaccines being spread by WhatsApp. It was just that the technology of WhatsApp allows so easily and quickly to forward on to massive groups that this was viral, and this information that was false about vaccination was going everywhere. And so the question for a public health authority or a national authority in India is, who am I supposed to call? What am I supposed to do about this? WhatsApp is a private company in the United States who has its own policies and its own, structures and decision making that it has made. So what am I supposed to do as a public institution who needs to deal with this? Another example from last year, 2018, the article was in 2018 in Wired about the impact of the NotPetya cyber attacks on global shipping. There's an amazing article from an easy-to-understand perspective about how this cyber attack, which was a state-sanctioned cyber attack, affected global shipping all over the world because the networks that these companies operate on were demolished, and it just caused havoc all over the world. So this is this point of interdependence, is that we're all connected, these knock-on effects, and therefore we all have a responsibility to build a digital future that is more inclusive and safe for all of us.
So as you just said, the panel brought together a very diverse array of people, both in nationalities, but also their background. There were academics, there were researchers, but there were also technologists, entrepreneurs. They couldn't agree on many things, and actually they were very transparent about it in the report, which I thought was interesting. And one thing they couldn't agree on was the architecture to adopt for digital cooperation globally. And they ended up laying out several options because they couldn't agree on which option was the best. So what does that tell us about the ways to cooperate in the future on issues as crucial and sensitive and frankly quite divisive as fairness, responsibility, ethics? What does that tell you? What did you take away from that?
I guess a very typical UN answer is to say that it's going to take a while, first of all. But yes, the panel's makeup was so diverse, and I think that was a benefit, but also it meant that they didn't come to an easy answer. I think it would have been easier if all of them were technologists. They might have all come out and been like, oh, here's a solution, here's the API, whatever, we're done. And we did actually consult with people in Silicon Valley and elsewhere who kind of thought that way. They were like, well, just give us metrics and we'll make sure that we don't have this much fake news, or we have to reach this limit each year and bring it down every year, and make it like a having a metric or a gamification of it, and we'll get there. But it's more complicated than that. And so when you bring in an economist, or when you bring in an activist from Nairobi, or you bring in a woman who's been in the telecommunications industry for years and who's seen the gender power struggles for 2 decades of her career, it's a different conversation. Or you bring in a minister of development from a Scandinavian country who has a totally different mindset. So the fact that they didn't come up with an answer, it just goes to show how complex the issues are. There's political issues, there's ethical issues, there's sociological challenges, and the fact that different countries have different governance. The report lays out 3 options of where we might be going as far as structure for global cooperation on some of these issues. And I think it's going to be a few more years of dialogue to come. But I think that the main point the panel made was whatever the solution is, it has to be a multi-stakeholder. So it's not just all the governments of the world getting together and establishing laws. It has to include industry. It has to include public sector, civil society. And the second thing is that they said it has to be agile and dynamic. I think everyone understands that in the digital age, you can't create a regulation that just stays static. It has to be flexible enough to change because, 11 years ago, we didn't even have a smartphone.
Mona, let me turn to you now. When we talk about tech responsibility and the unintended consequences of tech these days, we often talk about AI. There's a lot of talk about AI biases these days, and you've looked at the global outlook for national AI strategies, and specifically you've looked at the ethical framework of these. So can you just tell us what countries you've looked at and what that taught you about the different approaches that there are around the world towards this question of AI ethics?
Okay, thanks. Is this on? Yeah. All right, so just sort of to let you know, national AI strategies are sort of national policy documents that are fundamentally about where should we put our money. And it's within the global landscape of national AI strategies, there are basically two main concerns. One is global competition, the economy. And within that, it's very much about, getting ahead or catching up, depending on where you stand in the so-called global AI race. So this is about research capacity, talent retention, innovation, and also hardware. And the other main concern is national security, which includes military defense and also defense of democratic systems and so on. Within that, you see ethics come up more and more. So in a way, these national AI strategies focus on ethics as a way of talking to each other competitively as well. You see that coming up around the globe. China, for example, has published the Beijing AI Principles, which are also an ethical framework. In terms of the countries I looked at, I tried to really look at everything. I had a map and looked at every country. And if they had a national AI strategy, if they don't, that doesn't mean that there's nothing happening in terms of technology innovation in the country. The United States don't really have an AI strategy. And so it's quite interesting to see. One thing I will also say as a sociologist, when I look at this global landscape, what you can really see is sort of kind of colonial patterns right there. You'll see a corporate players come into the global south and sort of set the standards and sort of set the tone in terms of AI ethics, invest there as well, and it's a really interesting arena for looking at the global politics of knowledge production and power.
And so when you look at these different ethical approaches, how resemblant are they to one another? How different are they? And is that, what do you take from it? Is that ethics approach the right framework, or is it not? And if not, what would be a better approach?
Okay, that's a tricky question because as a sociologist, I like to sort of be the critical voice in the room. So I would, first of all, ask, what do we mean by ethics? And I suppose we're going to talk about that a little bit, maybe later in this conversation. There are, of course, cultural differences in terms of how ethics are being framed in these policies. For example, the Scandinavian countries sort of really talk about ethics in terms of social good and also in terms of investing in the public sector, for example. If we look at China, China has, as I said, also an ethics framework at this point, and the ethics there are about the ethics of work, for example. So these are also ethics. So really, I think we need to step back really, and look at what do we mean by ethics and be very careful and critical. What does that actually mean? And I think I would say at the moment we can sort of roughly distinguish between a technological approach and a policy approach to ethics. One is about moral machines, the other one is about policy frameworks, on the grander scale with governments, but also policy frameworks within corporations that target the behavior of technologists. And so again, it depends. So, but I will say that ethics is a really good window of looking into how we think about technology in society.
So you were just talking about China. It's from the outside look. It seems like it has one of the most comprehensive national AI strategies. It's investing a lot in AI, and you said right now that something I didn't know, that they have actually a big ethical part to that national approach, which sounds different than what we might hear, what we might think about when we talk about ethics in France, where I'm from, or in the US, or in the Scandinavian countries. So what does that tell us about the what's behind these term ethics when we think about it globally? Because right now there's also this conversation about people in the US being worried that many huge tech companies like TikTok, like Huawei, are Chinese owned, and they worry about several things, spying, but they also worry, frankly, about the values embedded in those technologies that are very important on a global scale. So what do you think about this worry, seeing it from the work you've done?
Again, that's a tricky question because I don't know how much this actually has to do with ethics. I think I would actually play back and say we maybe have to ask ourselves again, where does ethics come from? What kind of a framework is that? And it's the way in which we talk about it here is very much rooted in Western philosophy, and more specifically moral philosophy. So I leave that here. And encourage you to think about that when you look at, the different kinds of framings of ethics, especially as we sort of look east and south from here. So what you just described to me is not about ethics. I think it's about competition and the economy. So if you mentioned the TikTok case. And I think it's very dangerous to sort of focus on ethics within that and sort of just talk about the values, quote unquote, embedded into these technologies, because these are human machine systems, and sort of just blaming the machine really lets everybody off the hook. So I would really caution us all to sort of dig a little deeper right there and sort of look at it for what it is. And it really links back to the global landscape of national AI strategies, in the sense that this is about global competition and sort of how we imagine the next sort of economic phase to be. You hear a lot about the fourth industrial revolution and so on, and we can critically talk about that as well, but it's about, imagining certain futures.
And so many people at the moment talk about an AI race on the global scale. Are we actually witnessing an AI ethical race today? From what you've been just describing to us, everyone is trying to come up with their own AI ethics strategy and impose that.
Yes. That's a short answer. Yes, I think ethics is being used to, again, position countries, corporations, organizations competitively on a global stage, which is both an opportunity and a challenge, if I may use commercial language here. Yes, I think definitely that is happening. But I think again that if we sort of dare to critique ethics and sort of look at the politics of technology in society and sort of look at inequality, if we sort of question these frameworks and terminologies, then I think that's a real chance to really, quote unquote, do good. And I would also say one of the things, and I really want to get that in here, apologies for that, when we think about, this is called all tech is human, we absolutely have to think about the climate crisis and sort of really push beyond centering the human in these kinds of questions. And I think the tech community in the next year is really going to go there. I think we already see that quite a bit. But again, ethics, looking critically at ethics as a Western ontology, allows us to sort of move into that direction and critique that and sort of maybe develop alternative frameworks that are more helpful in that way.
That's a very interesting point. I was just going to add something more common than a question, but about this global AI ethics race. I think the EU is interesting in that regard because I feel like it's sort of hoping to become and betting on becoming the champion of AI ethics at the moment, just like it did with online privacy with the GDPR and sort of positioning itself on that field as their competitive advantage, basically. Do you agree with that? With that comment?
I do agree with that very much. That's sort of and that's not a secret. I mean, the commission sort of kind of says that's our brand, and we're going for it. That's definitely happening. The big worry is though that which again is the problematic narrative. Oh, if we sort of clamp down on innovation through regulation, what are we going to do? So there's a lot of money that's being invested into technical innovation at the same time. But yeah, that's definitely happening for sure.
So, Mark, let me turn to you now, and I'll let you pass the mic. So, AI ethics are on everyone's minds right now, and we just talked about it with Mona, but you argue that human rights are actually a more robust and a better framework to look at these issues for big tech companies, and you say that they should use that as their North Star. Actually, a few countries, France and Canada, have integrated that into their AI national strategy. They've integrated human rights. So can you tell us why you think that's a better lens to look at the future of responsible AI?
Okay, thanks for that question. I mean, I guess I would address that first by perhaps putting to bed the kind of fallacy that there is a sort of either or between ethics and human rights, or that ethics sort of sit in opposition to human rights. In fact, they're complementary. And so in a report that I wrote last year on AI governance and human rights, I argue that what the AI space has opened up is sort of a discussion, struggle even, over values. So like, what values will reign supreme in our global world? And I also talk about human rights as this global formulation of those values that actually does work. It does work for us. In other words, it's a blueprint for kind of like what it takes to uphold human dignity in the sort of AI and tech space, regardless of jurisdiction, regardless of country, regardless of individual status in society. And so this common language is something that sort of points us to the stakes and things that are at risk with these technologies as they're being deployed. Things like the right to privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, non-discrimination, equality, right to education and work. These are all, I mean, these are fundamental human rights, but they're ways of sort of focusing our attention on both the negative and positive aspects of AI. And I say it's an important global formulation because it has legitimacy. So, governments, corporations, even ourselves, human rights is grounded in international human rights law, which was adopted 71 years ago in the aftermath of catastrophe, really, World War II and the Holocaust. They make up what's called the, International Bill of Rights, Universal Declaration, and the, covenants on, civil, political rights, and economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, human rights is not perfect. It's a deeply political type of space, and they're unevenly applied across the globe, et cetera. But I do wonder, and I would sort of ask you to wonder as well, like, what would take its place? What would get, and again, I sort of did mention catastrophe, like, what would get the world's governments or populations or institutions to come together to come up with a new sort of global standard? And that's a very hard lift. And so I think about, turning to human rights as something ready-made for us to sort of use. Now, how it relates to ethics, listen, a document written 71 years ago and some laws that were passed also a little bit after that, it could never capture all the new quandaries and questions that AI is bringing us. And, like the Universal Declaration didn't include the trolley problem as a sort of, as an issue there. So that's where I think sort of ethics certainly comes in, and this sort of questioning and deliberation that I think ethics is really, that's where it sort of fits in there. And I would sort of, if anyone's interested in more about this topic, Vidushi Marda from Article 90 in Bangalore and Karina Kath from OII and others have been writing a lot about this topic.
So you do call for human rights impact assessments by big tech companies. Can you explain what they look like, what they imply?
Sure. So human rights impact assessment you can think of as a way to operationalize human rights. So it's a pragmatic way to discuss and evaluate the human rights impact of a technology, a company, a product, and sort of how that fits into processes and practices on the ground. So about 10 years ago, the UN put out a report called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which actually says that businesses also have obligations to respect human rights. And part of the way that businesses can figure out, AI businesses, for instance, whether they're respecting those rights is to conduct a human rights impact assessment on its sort of products. And interestingly enough, that has been taken up by particularly Microsoft, but also Google, which has human rights as one of its founding principles on AI, just conducted a human rights impact assessment of a facial recognition technology. Intel has done a human rights impact assessment. Even Facebook has done a human rights impact assessment sort of post-Myanmar to sort of understand how its technology was used to exacerbate genocide in Myanmar. And so I think we're seeing a lot of different applications of human rights impact assessment, even though I would go a little bit further and talk about how, and so this is someone named Roya Paxad and I have been working on, thinking about, instead of thinking only about the impact of a technology, particularly after the technology has already been created, to start bringing human rights sort of thinking and thinking about those individual rights as the design process is happening.
Sure. And would that be similar to, I know there's calls today in the technology sphere, in that community, for companies to always, in the design process, as you were just mentioning, look at the ways in which the technology can be abused. Is that a similar approach?
It is in some ways. So, of course, the human rights, the privacy, and freedom of expression, to understand the negative impact of a technology in those in that domain is important. But the thing about human rights, and so I'll just sort of plug this, is it's not, I think the first priority is on the negative impact on vulnerable and marginalized people. But also a human rights impact assessment will also sort of unearth the positive impacts that a technology can have on the enjoyment of different rights, like the right to education, disability access, rights to women and migrants. And so I think there's a lot of space for sort of the quote-unquote positive aspects that human rights could sort of analyze.
Sure. And so how do you reconcile this approach with the sort of move fast and break things mentality that is still prevailing, frankly, in sometimes in the field, especially when you think about the race that we were just mentioning, with some countries trying to take a lead on certain technologies?
Yeah, I have no problem with move fast and break things if you're moving fast and breaking things in a lab, in an organization with padded walls and just people in there who are employees who have signed consent forms to participate in this exercise. But when you are talking about that mentality deploying tools in the wild, so on people, I think it's one of the most deeply irresponsible arrogant and chauvinistic sort of practices a company could, deploy.
Some resonance in the room. Mona, I just want to ask you, sort of building on that last question that we addressed with Mark, there's been a lot of debate recently about the ways in which tech companies are trying to address the unfairness of technology, so trying to make it more fair, but in the process using very problematic methods. So I'm thinking here of Google's Pixel 4 phone. You might have read about this. They reportedly, to try and make the facial recognition setting more fair, so that it would recognize all people, including people with darker skins, which we know is sometimes a bias that the facial recognition technology has. It targeted people in the field, dark-colored people, but from vulnerable backgrounds, so like homeless people in Atlanta, for example. Reportedly, there were reports about that in the press. And so there were questions about how do we go about avoiding that when we're trying, in a very good and well-intentioned way to make the technology better and more inclusive and more fair, how do we avoid that in the process we might do harm in a way and do things that are questionable?
Okay. First of all, I would put a question mark behind well-intentioned, or sort of interrogate the notion of intention or not intention here. I think we really have to look at the sort of power structures, the structures and dynamics of oppression, the histories of oppression that are really coming through in these kinds of cases. They are so blatantly obvious. So I'll leave that here. I think with specific regards to facial recognition technology, again, we have to ask ourselves, do we even want to design this kind of technology? Do we actually need that kind of technology? So I'll leave that here as well, because I don't think there is any easy answer to that. And I think we also have to ask ourselves, do we want to improve these kinds of processes? Because ultimately, this will lead to more surveillance, more sophisticated surveillance. So the problems only start there. That's one thing. The other thing leads back to ethics. Actually, I think one of the ways in which ethics can be useful is in terms of research ethics. Of course, I say that as a sociologist and an educator, but I think it can be helpful to think about innovation along the lines of research. So what Mark said around consent, around reflexivity, I think that's something technologists really have to learn as the policymakers, locating themselves critically in the world they live in and sort of thinking through sort of the systems of privilege and power that they use to make their policies or their technologies. I think if we start there, and that links back to education and the role of the university and other kinds of educational projects, whether that's on community level or that's on any level. So I think, yeah, this is Pandora's box,
Yeah.
No easy answer.
Mark, this question of power imbalance, as Mona really rightfully so reframed it, is something you've looked at really closely in your research. So in the field, you've looked at digital identities for migrants and refugees. Can you tell us a little bit more about that power imbalance and what you've noticed on the field?
Sure, I'd say it's one of the lessons I've learned from, I guess, having the privilege to speak with migrants and refugees from Syria, Iraq, East Africa, who have made their way in harrowing journeys to Europe and refugee camps there, is that, with digital ID systems, so we're talking about fingerprint scans, iris scans, and those types of biometric types of data gathering. They're often used, again, they're sort of perhaps well-intentioned, but also, are being deployed without people's consent. In fact, coercion to get those biometrics in exchange for, so imagine having to submit to biometrics in exchange for food, shelter, clothing, access to medicine, access to a border. It in many ways, just access to a border and to a border itself is an inherently sort of power asymmetric endeavor. And so if you have a vulnerable group who is marginalized in a society, who is discriminated against and stigmatized by the mere virtue of that they came and so their legal status, et cetera, that itself is a power, there's a power imbalance there. And so it's rife for violations of human rights. Now, so that's the social structure. If you add in a layer of technology, whether it's biometrics or AI or facial recognition, if you're not designing that technology to actively address those power imbalances, you are very most likely exacerbating those issues. And so I guess those are some of the lessons learned from that type of field research.
And so this question of power imbalance is also partly due to the fact to geographical concentration. So basically, we have two main players in the tech field, the U.S. and China. And so you, Anush, you've worked on that UN panel. It brought people from all over the world, from many different regions, not just these two main players. What did it teach you about ways to address that and to bring more diversity in this global outlook?
Well, the thing of the diverse voices in that panel really struck me as I was listening to Mona and Mark's back and forth, because it not only were the voices in this panel from different parts of the world, but as I mentioned, the other diversity of this panel was where they are as far as in their professions. And it is so different to hear Mona and Mark talk about these issues from like a sociological point of view, an academic point of view, than it is to hear a business person talk about it, or to hear someone who is a minister of development in a European country or a non-European country, for that matter, who are more pragmatic about it. So as the problem statements that both of you have raised, the conversation would be totally different if you were two different people, right? And that for me, in addition, so then that one thing, so my takeaway from that was either we all need to better understand how the other players in our field think and speak to be able to make our case, right? If Mona's a sociologist, but she's talking to an executive who's making basic, quick decisions at Microsoft because they are in an AI race and they are not going to lose to Huawei or whoever, so they need to make decisions every quarter. She has to be able to speak to them or make her points in a way that that person's going to understand. So either we need to understand how to speak to each other, or we need translators who can. So everyone can stay in their lanes and be good at being an executive and be good at being a legislator and be good at being a sociologist, but then someone has to be able to translate in between. So then that's the types of people. Then the global perspective, yeah, also listening to Mona and Mark's reflections on the thing of how different the interpretation of ethics is in different countries, or even the interpretation of human rights. As Mark said, we have an enshrined legal international document, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Every country in the world is committed to it, signed on to it, it's legal. But, as Mark said, it's interpreted differently, because in Venezuela, it may mean something different to say freedom of assembly than it does in Sweden. And in China, it may mean something different than it does in India. And that I only concluded with a question mark. I'm not sure, because it's true, the definitions exacerbated by the race is the whole point why the Secretary General was so concerned about this space and called it an effort at digital cooperation, because right now we're seeing competition and a diversity of interpretations of what even some of these internationally agreed laws like human rights are. And so it's very fraught, and I'm not sure, other than that we need more bridge builders. I don't know what else the answer is.
You want to add something, Mona?
Sorry, Sheen. I think that is the issue around translation and language is really, really important, and I cannot highlight this enough. I think that's really an opportunity now, this sort of age of AI or technology, whatever we find ourselves in or not, and different kinds of crises, democracy, climate, everything really. We need this kind of focus on translation, and I think we need to reframe our notion of expertise, who counts as expert, and really understand that people fundamentally are experts in their own lives. And really take that much more seriously. And I really think that especially the university and educational institutions have a responsibility to sort of break down their own ivory tower walls, as it were, and become platforms to develop these kinds of translation skills and this kind of communication. I'm sort of speaking to my community here, but I really think, can't emphasize this enough.
Mark, I think, has something to add.
Well, I'm going to double down on my colleagues' encouragement or suggestion or pleading, really, that translation is the key. I also think the same way. What I've learned in sort of looking at the social dynamics of emerging technology, sort of my field of study, is that particularly in a field like AI, just say. I mean, AI, we talk about it as sort of a technology, but it's kind of not. It's a socio-technical sort of system and constellation of different technologies and people and institutions, et cetera. And so, yeah, there are experts in the technical aspects of just say machine learning. But there are also experts in the social impact, the impact on their individual communities, moral philosophy, human rights, policy. And I mean, in some sense, it's a little bit scary because there is no one expert to tell us what to do about AI. I mean, it's just the nature of how this technology is emerging. And it could be, one can look at it with all these like ethical principles that are being released weekly, I guess, and different strategies. It could look sort of almost like a crisis of legitimacy. But in other ways, it could also be kind of a flourishing of more pluralistic sort of ideas that we're going to need to really address the issue.
Before we open the floor to questions, I wanted to ask a question to the three of you. The Microsoft President Brad Smith has recently called for a digital Geneva Convention. In the report that you've worked on, we've seen, I don't know if it was the whole group or members, but a call for a Hippocratic oath for developers. So I just want to open this question to you. What do you think we could imagine? What would you want to see to foster responsible tech in the future? And maybe Anush, we can start with you.
I think it's hopefully a mixture of both of those types of things. So the thing that Microsoft's president Brad Smith has called for, this Geneva Convention for digital, I forget the exact phrase he uses, is to say that we should have laws that protect civilian databases against attack, the same way that in international law for war that governs the way wars are conducted, that it is illegal by international law to attack a hospital, for instance, or a school. So this would, if that were to become to be, it would have to be an effort by governments as well as companies to make these agreements. Whereas the other one, a Hippocratic oath for developers, for instance, is a little bit potentially more bottom up. Maybe it comes more from the academia, or maybe that comes from the individuals. So sort of thinking of Chris's lightning talk a few minutes ago, this thing of there's government, there's corporations, and there's people power. I think all of those have to come at play. And I think, for instance, the walkouts or the idea of a Hippocratic oath may be driven by those who are the technologists in these companies. So at the end of the day, we are the humans on whom this digital experiment is being unleashed. And so I think both, it has to come from a governance world of like international laws and treaties, but it also can come from individuals or like alliances of students or universities or other sort of people-powered initiatives like Hippocratic oaths or commitments that when I take a job, I'm never going to XYZ. So I think it's got to be both.
Mark?
It's hard to follow Anusha's comprehensive answer there, but why don't I just add, I guess from my perspective, and even the human rights perspective as well. So an essential aspect of sort of human rights thinking and human rights law has to do with remedy. Remedy, accountability for actions. And so even the sort of human rights impact assessment, there needs to be some sort of plan for remedy when things go wrong. And so, I like the efforts around, sort of grand coming togethers to have these sort of principles and those types of things. But I think if there's not some mechanism for accountability when things go wrong, and with any time, I mean, it always will go wrong, and people are harmed, some way for that, even the individual or group to access justice, I think, that just needs to be there.
Mona?
Well, that's a tough one to follow those two. I fully agree. Accountability, enforcement, and so on for sure. I will be, again, the critical scholar in the room and say I'm very skeptic about the idea of a Hippocratic oath, simply because if you look at the kinds of professions that have a Hippocratic oath, there is a one-to-one relationship between a patient and a doctor, between a lawyer and a client, and that is just simply not possible between one machine learning expert and a data set of, I don't know, 10 million people. It is impossible, and therefore it's a smokescreen, I think. I think we shouldn't even entertain the idea. I think it's a strategic distraction from actually talking about the real things, talking about ethics in very concrete ways, talking about human rights, talking about how we can revamp engineering education, how we can sort of, do all these things what we just talked about. So I'm going to leave that here.
Well, that's a great point to end on. So I'm going to open the room for a question. I think we have 10 minutes. So I have this funny-looking mic that I'm going to pass around to whoever has a question. And apparently it's lower than these actual mics, so you will have to speak up a little bit. Yeah. I'll let you maybe pass it around after, but...
Throw it.
Oh, you can throw it.
Yeah,
There you go.
That's why it's
Wait, I'm really talking to you like
Even
this?
better.
Hi.
Maybe introduce yourself before you ask
Hi,
your
I'm
question.
John. I work in the data privacy space. I really enjoyed your conversation this morning. Two things you brought up about big challenges are the disparity and the differences of how different cultures define ethics, and also just the complexity of these issues. I liked, Mark, your using as a North Star human rights, or just like a foundational starting point. And I was curious, Anush, if in the digital cooperation group that was formed, if you contemplated using that, and also, because the UN already has like the declaration and things in place, even though you spoke about how even the interpretation of that can be quite different, you have to start somewhere. And the fact that that already exists and there's already cooperation across the space for that, why not use that at least as one of the kind of pillars and a starting place of how we can advance?
Yes, the panel came down hard on that. Actually, it's one of the most black and white things in the report, which says that, well, there's something we didn't touch on today, but over the last 2 decades or so, there's been a conversation about digital rights. There's whole communities around it. Some of you may be part of those organizations that are out there in the world. The report of the panel sort of suggested, not to say that that's wrong, but let's stop talking about digital rights and human rights as separate. It's that they are human rights. We are now living in a digital age. The human rights are just as applicable now as they were, or they are just as applicable online as they were offline. So it says that in black and white. And it also says, I think there's sort of 5 key recommendation areas. The third area of recommendations is about this human rights and human agency question. And the first step in the recommendation, which maybe Mark can speak to, is let us review the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the context of the digital age. And that's, since the report came out in June, some of the next steps have included having the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva sort of work with other stakeholders to start that process, which actually some of it was already underway. So yes, they did come down and say, we have this, let's use this as a base.
Mark, do you want to? No? Yeah, okay. So maybe throw the mic to whoever wants it. I think here in the back.
Ready?
Thanks, guys.
And speak close to it, I think, and loudly.
Yeah, really appreciate the great conversation that we had. My name is James, currently doing research in machine learning stuff. So I think with Anush and Mona, both of you kind of raised that, emphasize on the importance of having these translators who are able to kind of understand and speak in different language with different stakeholders, right? So, and I think that some of the people who kind of in charge of that translation, especially toward the public, the press, right? So I'm just curious, what do you think, or how tech journalists can be more responsible in terms of their writing or their even podcast conversation, for example, to be more responsible in terms of covering some of these issues in ethics and data privacy and along those lines, yeah.
I think that's a question for Sheen, the journalist in the room. There is a shift in that. I will just say that in the work of the high-level panel, I really wanted for us to have a chance to talk to media as its own stakeholder group. We unfortunately ran out of time, but I think we could have had a really interesting dialogue about the role the media plays in, maybe for the last decade or so, fetishizing or rock star-sizing tech industry and innovation and move fast and break things and making that sound as cool as possible. Whereas now we're starting to see the journalists saying maybe our responsibility is not just to make that seem as cool as possible, but ask key questions. And I think Sheen is the one.
Yeah, I would just say that I think there's a lot of there's a growing interest, and you see even in media towards this question of responsible tech, biases, unintended consequences of tech. You see people with this beat in newsrooms now. This wasn't the case like a year and a half ago even. And I think when I created my podcast, I was sort of like, it's so niche. That's what people told me. And I was like, no, it's not. It's about human rights today. And so I think people are realizing that, and there's more and more. It's not enough yet, but there's more and more attention to these issues. Okay, throw the mic.
Hi there. My name is Ginny Foz, and I'm an Aspen Tech Policy Fellow working on extending government digital services to vulnerable populations like older adults. And I have a question for Mark about this human rights impact assessment, because you made a great point about the importance of remedy and accountability, and I'm wondering what the mechanism for those things are in the human rights impact assessment process.
I mean, it's a hard question, but I think even in the first aspect that there is one, there is a mechanism, and so once you've sort of, charted out the risks and potential harms, like how to, one aspect could be is there someone designated in a company, let's just say, who would even receive that type of information? And I think what we saw on Facebook Myanmar, there were a number of, so I visited Myanmar not too long afterwards, and I heard from a lot of different civil society organizations who had tried to flag up to Facebook corporate the concerns that they were actually seeing on the ground of, how hate speech was leading to violence and even death. And while their messages kind of got to someone at Facebook, there was no sort of scaffolding to flag those up, the sort of chain of command to someone who could actually do something about that in a meaningful way. And so I guess that is one sort of idea. So at least having some mechanism to at least get that type of information, and then a plan to sort of figure out what to do with it. Now it's very hard because, it's very hard to remedy, how exactly do you remedy a group of people who have experienced genocide, who are now living in a completely different country because of that. Those are hard questions that I don't know the answer to necessarily, but at least sort of this human rights impact assessment gets us thinking about those types of processes and how to implement those within an organization.
And are the assessments published publicly or not?
There is an idea that for an assessment, sort of the accountability thing that I was talking about, that transparency leads to accountability in some respects. Not always, but in some respects. And so publishing a human rights impact assessment is important. That said, rarely are human rights impact assessments published. I think the UN, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, has a website with all the sort of published human rights impact assessments, and most of them have nothing to do with technology, sort of, garment factories and landmines and things like that. The Facebook and Google's just last week, human rights impact assessment of their facial recognition, that is public. So, and there's a lot of different organizations like Business for Social Responsibility and others who have published, the how-to guide to do a human rights impact assessment.
So I think we have time for a few more questions. You want to tell us who you are?
Hello, I'm Brandon. I'm an artist that works intersection of tech and theater and dance. And I'm super sensitive to especially Anush, what you're saying about how long things take in the United Nations and kind of all the larger challenges we're dealing with. But kind of a simple question, which is like, how do we move faster? Like, we're at a moment where there's so many crises, from climate to this. I find this AI really to be a crisis, and the companies aren't slowing down. And I'm wondering how we as citizens and leaders and people who are clearly interested in this work, how can we push places like the United Nations to move faster so that we don't find ourselves in another crisis, or for that major event that y'all were talking about is going to happen. So how do we prevent that from happening in advance?
It's I think the realization is there. I've been in the UN in different roles in the last 8 years or so, and the sense is there that the structure needs reforming, but it is hard because it's an old institution. And at the end of the day, I mean, there's lots of parts of the UN, so not to simplify, but at the core of it, it is all of the governments of all of the world. So if you think about how Congress is dysfunctional, multiply that by a lot, and think about how it is when all of the countries, all of the governments of the world need to discuss things. That said, I think that on the personnel side or the human resource side, people are starting to see ways to crack a little bit. So one way is to build the capacity of individuals who work in these institutions, not only the UN, other bureaucracies, who understand the issues or are out there in the world trying to understand what the issues are, especially when they're these frontier kinds of topics. And then finding creative ways of surfacing the issues to policymakers. And I think the fact that you come from an arts background, I wouldn't underestimate the value of an exhibition. If you can bring some diplomats or some bureaucrats to an exhibit that shows them the implications of data privacy on everyday humans, or if you had an amazing newspaper article that came out, that circulates fast in any government or any UN institution. People forward those articles quickly. And so I think that those outside pressures, as well as building up the human capacity inside these institutions, is one way. And another is, I think the urgency is felt. So I don't know what else it can be done. I think everyone knows that it needs to be accelerated, but it's a work in progress.
I think we have time for just one more question. If there is one, yeah?
Hi. It feels like talking into a pillow. My name's
It
Alan.
does. It's very strange, but funny.
I'm a software developer, and my question was originally for Mark, but I think could be fielded by anyone on the panel. My question is, it sounds like the idea here is that like the academics and the NGOs are gonna like get the tech companies and like really sink their teeth in and hobble them from misbehaving in the future. But it also seems like the tech companies are trying to sink their teeth into the academics and the NGOs and buy them off. And so my question is like, who's the predator and who's the prey here? Who's gonna win?
Great.
Give me hope.
I think look around the room. Here's your hope. I mean, we're having these kinds of conversations, and I think that's really amazing. And I think what we all need to do, regardless on where we stand, is to just be a little bit more critical, woke, sort of aware of what's happening, and sort of give each other the tools that we need to do that productively. So for people like me, that means, learning a bit more about the doing of technology, and maybe for a technologist, for you, that means sort of doing a bit more sort of maybe social science or whatever, political stuff and thinking. But yeah, I mean, there's so much hope.
I think that's a great way
Time's up.
to end. Time is up. Thank you so much. Thank you.